Hello, good day. This is Sir Yuan. Welcome to the survey of Philippine literature in English. If you are watching this video lesson, we are either in a emergency situation or in an online situation. So let us proceed. So for today's lesson, we'll be talking about the things, a few things, rather a few things. We will be talking about what is literature, the importance of literature, the types of literature, as well as literary approaches, theories, and criticism. Um, we'll be starting this slowly so that you'll be able to understand what literature is before we do a survey of Philippine literature. So, what is literature? Now, again, from our understanding with literature, it comes from the Latin word litera, which means acquaintance with letters. So once we are acquainted with letters, we are able to build a situation, a story using letters. Okay, so literature is a product of a particular culture that concretizes man's or the individual's values, emotions, actions, and ideas. So it is therefore a creation of human experiences that tells about the world and its people. Also, literature is an art that reflects the works of imagination, aesthetics, and creative writing, which are distinguished for the beauty of style or expression. So, when we talk about literature, we are talking about letters arranged in such a way that they were able to produce or convey emotions and or a particular story in a given context aesthetically. So when you say aesthetically, the story, or rather the arrangement of letters into a story, gave the reader or the audience the benefit of appreciation, given that they were alienated and at the same time able to appreciate the imaginative implications of literature as they are experiencing it. Now, why should we care? Why should we study literature? In this case, Philippine literature. Now, studying literature is like looking at the mirror of life where man's experiences and feelings, thoughts are reflected. It is also talking about we are studying the experience of man. It is like anthropology, but in letters or in stories. Through literature, we learn the culture of people across time and space. Moreover, we become familiar not only with the culture of neighboring cultures or countries, but also with that of others living very far from us. For example, since we are in the Philippines, we are not able to go, or rather, the ticket going abroad to the United States is not always accessible. However, through their literature, we are able to access their culture and their experience as if we were living in the United States. So, the stories like the Old Man in the Sea. We have dramas like Death of the Salesman. Talks about certain particular culture that is prevalent in that particular country, in their particular culture, that we may or may not have, and therefore we are able to live those experiences, we're able to study those experiences and those thoughts and feelings that the characters are having. Okay, so when you talk about literature, when you talk about the characters in a story, we are not talking about mere imaginations only. They are product or manifestations of their experience, of their culture in letters. This is why we are able to relate to them, simply because we feel a particular emotive approach, a particular empathetic approach towards certain experiences, therefore creating it or making it a very human um, experience, a very profound one, although it is not very profound given that you are reading it. Now we have a genre of literature, or types of literature. We have poetry, we have fiction, we have nonfiction, drama, and prose. Now let's go over them one by one. So a poem is a piece of literature that makes use of rhythmic qualities of language, such as phonestetics, sound symbolism, and meter to convey meaning. Um, a poem's meter or rhythm and its focus on the sounds of syllables, words, and phrases distinguish it from other types of literature. So it is exclusive only to poetry. With fiction, there are several purposes with fiction, including entertaining, to inspire, to inform, and to persuade the target audience. Now, fictional literature includes a variety of subgenres such as mystery, romance, or mythology. Now, with works of fiction, sometimes it can be in the form of a poem, especially in the case of epics. We'll talk about that today. Nonfiction writing aims to inform or inspire the audience by using actual events, people, places, or facts. So, examples of nonfiction, we have biographies, autobiographies, um, we have essays, no, for nonfiction. Next, we have drama. Dramas are representations of fiction that involve dialogue and performance. Dramatic literature includes epic poetry rather, lyric poetry, and novels. A drama contains dialogue, and the actors portray the characters through impersonations, or they play a role, role playing. A dramatic piece of literature contains acts or scenes that rely on props or imaginative dialogue to create a visual experience. Then lastly, we have prose. Prose is a literary genre with no formal metric structure. Instead of relying to rhythmic structure, as in traditional poetry, it relies on a natural flow of speech and ordinary grammatical structure. It involves clear, concise paragraphs that may be fiction or nonfiction. Now, let's talk about poetry. So, for our examples here and the purposes of our class for today, we have three examples. We have epics, lyrics, and narratives. Now, epics are long verse narratives retelling the heroic journey of an individual or a group of individuals. An epic typically features superhuman features, extraordinary adventures, highly stylized language, and a combination of lyrical and dramatic elements. To add, epics also include magical creatures and at the same time magical events, no? Or rather, in this case, extraordinary adventures or superhuman features. So, for example, with our Philippine literature, with Philippine epics, uh, we usually have characters who would always come back to life. There is also what we call divine intervention with epics, where the gods were able to intervene with more with the characters' day-to-day life. They were able to resurrect the characters from the dead, so on and so forth. Also, like I mentioned earlier, epics also include magical creatures. For example, in our case in the Philippines, we have the aswang, um, the capre, the dwarves, the elves, sometimes flying horses, to name a few. Now, narratives are poems that tell a story through poetic techniques such as a rhyme, rhythm, similes, and metaphors. Now, narrative poems are longer than other forms of poetry and contain a complete story similar to a novel. However, with the difference between a narrative and an epic, a narrative usually doesn't have features like superhuman features, the supernatural. It doesn't contain extraordinary adventures. Um, However, it does have an adventure. It is very romantic in that particular sense. However, it is only um, a narration of a particular concept or a particular um, tribal trait or folklore or legend. Yeah. Now, lastly, lyric poems are short, highly musical verses that express powerful emotions. A lyric poem is a personal expression of emotion written in a single individual, or rather by a single individual, rather. So with lyric poetry, um, we usually find this as songs. Nowadays, songs are lyric poems. They are highly stylized, that they have very musical traits. Narratives can also be very musical. However, with Philippine literature, with Philippine tradition, rather, with our own narratives, we do not have a set of meter, or we don't have a very strict meter system or a metric system or very strict rhythm system. However, it is somewhat a free verse, still adhering to a particular meter or rhythm. So it's a bit difficult to explain. This is because um, researchers and other authors or other individuals from a particular tribe would always describe their form of poetry or song as if they were um, sea waves or breeze or wind. It comes and go. It is sometimes strong. It is sometimes weak. So it is like that, you know, especially with our own culture. Now let's go over to fiction. For the purposes of today's lesson, we have quite a few. So with fiction, we have first mystery. Now, mystery novels provide readers with plots that explore mysteries from beginning to end. One of the main characters in a mystery is typically a detective or a private investigator who solves the mystery with the reader. So there's an interactive approach, you know, with this particular genre. With historical fiction uses real life events to support its own plots and key details. It is usually a work of historical fiction that engages readers by retelling a historical event in a very creative way that alter minor details such as character names or the setting. This is usually found with, um, for example, video dramatizations or retelling of a particular historical event through movies. Next one, realism. Now, literary realism depicts familiar objects, people, and places without dramatizing or romanticizing the story. Now, literary realism emphasizes realistic characters and settings, detailed descriptions of everyday occurrences, and depiction of social classes. On the other hand, magical realism is a genre of literature that depicts reality with a sense of fantasy or magic. A magic realism story is a variation of realism fiction. It's just that there are certain occurrences or everyday occurrences or certain depictions where characters are involved in a very fantastical way. Writers such as Gabriel Garcia Marquez and um, other South American writers usually adhere to magical realism. This is because in their culture, life is already hard or difficult. And therefore, there is no need for us to describe how difficult life is. And also, magical realism paves a way for them to become happy, you know, according to them. This is why some Filipino writers also adapt this particular genre. Like for example, with um, unsa man ha? with with one of our local writers, Don Pagosara, also my teacher in when I was in college. He was very fond of magical realism, that so and so he would always inject a particular fantastic event or occurrence with his own stories, you know. Although he usually mainly writes historical fiction, but sometimes when he writes magical realistic stories, they are quite fantastic in a sense that it would depict certain occurrences or certain events in a very particular way. So I would highly go check him out. You can search him in Google if you'd like. No, so si Don Pagosara. Um, Other genres would include fantasy. So this includes mythology and folklore, sources of inspiration in fantasy novels. We have romance. I would say romance um, is very different from what we think about what romantic novels are. It is not about love, although romance is prominent element in forms of fiction. Romance talks about the development of a particular relationship, may it be friendship or the relationship of man and nature and the sense of adventure. Romance, romantic novels, romance, and love stories are very different. Love stories focus on love, romance, romantic novels, literature focus on the adventure of the end relationship. Science fiction. There are several themes that are characteristics of science fiction, including space exploration. We have futuristic species, time travel, and what have you. You know. So most of the stories revolve around scientific concepts such as physics, astronomy, anthropology, chemistry, and astrophysics. Dystopian stories envision a world that's in a state of decline. Usually, a dystopian fiction would depict societies with perpetual wars, social and economic class divisions, mass poverty, environmental destruction, anarchy, and loss of individuality. So, for example, with Hunger Games, the stories, the novels, the movie is a dystopian type of story. If you're talking about the book, then it's a dystopian type of novel. So we have Star Trek, Star Wars. What else? We have the Time Traveler's Wife. Sorry, Time Traveler's not Time Traveler's Wife. That would be science fiction. I would say The Ones Who Left Omelas. That particular story is a dystopian science fiction story, short story of which talks about the destruction of Omelas and why people left that particular society. Next would be horror. The primary goal of horror fiction is to shock and frighten readers. That's the main objective. It is not shocking, it's not frightening, it's not horror. You know, it is usually horror to a particular degree. Now, horror story involves character settings and plots that create suspense and tension for the reader. This becomes very interactive, especially the reader is able to imagine certain things, fantastical and terrifying things that would create a particular sense of horror whenever they're reading that particular story. So authors like Edgar Allan Poe, Nick Joaquin, our Edgar Allan Poe in the Philippines. We have um, sometimes again Sir Don Pagosara would write horror. Um, it's in the top of my tongue. My other teacher, I forgot his name, but he would also sometimes write horror stories, horror short stories. So they are very short, like 1 page short. When I say 1 page short, it's like A5, A4 short story. So it's usually just one sitting. Fables are quite different from horror. Now, fables typically teach a moral lesson. Sometimes it can be a horror story, sometimes, usually, it is a story that uses animals as their characters and as main examples or situations. So, usually, it illustrates a moral dilemma that the protagonist overcomes. Usually, fables use elements from nature, like animals, as their characters, natural events like lions eating other animals to depict a particular dilemma or a particular value. Lastly, mythology. The mythological genre reveals elements of human behavior through the use of symbols. Mythology includes themes such as gods, goddesses, and cultural phenomena. Symbols in mythology is very important as it drives the story forward and it gives context to other stories, connecting them in a particular culture. Like for example, with Greek mythology, every symbol per story connects that symbol to another symbol in a different Greek mythology or different Greek mythological story. This also applies to Philippine literature, especially our Mindanaoan mythology. Every symbol or every landmark in Mindanao connects that particular landmark to a particular story, to a particular god and event, and so on and so forth. Therefore, we are able to understand certain behaviors, certain tribal behaviors, given their mythology. Now, very different from fiction, non-fiction is quite different. It's not very fantastic. It can be boring. Uh, it is not very. It doesn't use flowery language or creative words. Now, for the purposes of our class today, we have three examples here. We have autobiography, biography, and essay. Autobiography talks about a narrative of life. So when you say autobiography, the writer is the person who has experienced that particular life. So it's like a diary, of their life. It's a personal narrative, as opposed to biography. A biography is an account of someone's life. May it be that account was written by relatives of the person, friends of the person, a ghost writer, someone who was not related to the person but was told stories about the person, gathered stories about the person, so on and so forth. An essay, um, in particular, is a short piece of writing in which the author elaborates on a particular topic or a particular concept or idea. So usually philosophers would use essays to convey their concepts, their ideas, the topic that they're questioning, the topic that they would like to answer, and the like. However, some philosophers also tend to use stories or analogies to explain certain things. Okay. Oh, sorry for that. With drama, we have four examples. We have tragedy, comedy, musical, and melodrama. Now, tragedy usually focus on hardships that can cause emotional distress to protagonists of the story. Before we move forward, when we say drama, these are representations of fiction. Again, they need to be performed. Otherwise, there will be no sense with drama or with dramatization. So, for example, if you would like to dramatize a particular story, then there will be certain dialogues of which may or may not be true, however inspired by events as per the story. So, when you say dramatization or drama, it should be performed. It is like poetry where literature is being performed either in a song or through a public display or show or showcase. Like, for example, with spoken word poetry. So again, going back to drama and tragedy, tragedies usually contain details that illustrate challenges that protagonists or characters usually experience. Like for example, Macbeth. We have Merchant of Venice. Although Merchant of Venice, I think they would um, tag that as comedy. But if you're talking about the experience of the merchant, then it would be a tragedy for him. Kay, again, in the story, he lost quite a lot by lending it to someone, so it's a tragedy for him. Um, yeah. So next one will be comedy. Comedy is a type of drama with a very humorous tone that depicts amusing events in which the characters ultimately prevail. Now, a comedy features a light-hearted tone, very clever wordplay of dialogue, turns of phrases, humorous discussions of serious topics. And so the goal for comedy is to make everybody entertained, to make everybody laugh. This is also very different with stand-up comedy. With stand-up comedy, um, There is no one particular story, but there are stories with stand-up comedy. It's just that with stand-up comedy, it's usually on the spot. So it's sometimes an experience or just a story, by the comedian. A musical can be an original work or an adaptation of longer literary works. Musical dramas tell a story through music and include direct expressions of themes through song. Hence, its genre name musical drama. As opposed to musical drama, melodramas are pieces of dramatic literature that depict serious stories. Melodrama may contain heroes, heroines, villains, mentors with flaws who overcome their limitations to achieve success. Melodramas may include elements from comedy, elements from tragedy, elements of action, or elements of musical dramas, where they incorporate all of those to create a particular showcase of talent. With melodramas, it's usually a very somber, sometimes sad um, retelling or telling of stories of sorts. We Filipinos, we are very fond of melodramas. This is because we are highly influenced by the Spaniards regarding the hardships of life. Aside from that, we are also fond of chismis. And so with chismis, chismis is, although I would not consider chismis as melodrama, but chismis is like, uh, or rather receiving chismis or listening to chismis gives us that particular sensation where we somehow feel guilty, feel sad, or feel happy, or feel awkwardly familiar with certain events of other people. So those are the main types of literature and the genre they are in. Now, this will be the last topic for today. We'll continue some other time with the other topics, but for now, we'll end here. Literary approaches. Now, with literary approaches, we have three. We have historical, biographical, moral, philosophical, and formalistic. Literary approaches are approaches which we will be using to understand stories, especially helpful and beneficial for you, given that we will be doing surveys or studies of Philippine literature. Now, what is historical biographical approach? Now, this approach sees a literary work as a reflection of the author's life and times or life or times of the characters in the work. It is this particular approach that investigates the plot, details, the settings, the characters of the work reflect or are representative of events, settings, and people in the author's life, or a direct outgrowth of the culture in which the author lived. So, for example, Jose Rizal's El Filibusterismo and Noli Me Tangere. These are historical biographical novels, works of fiction. However, they depict what Jose Rizal has seen from his life, from his own experience, how other people are suffering, how people are, in a very fantastical way of fighting or going against, injustice and love. Those particular novels. I'm not a fan of Rizal. I'm not a fan of Rizal. I'm not fan of his works. It's just that I find them very interesting to study, mainly because if you have read Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo, they somehow are like kining atuang The Provinciano o kanang mga uban Philippine teleseries where there is that particular power struggle and kining experiences that the characters are facing and experiencing. Next would be moral philosophical. Now, this approach takes the position that the larger function of literature is to teach morality and probe philosophical issues such as ethics, religion, or the nature of humanity itself. Now, literature is interpreted within the context of the philosophical thought of a period or group, such as Christianity, existentialism, and Buddhism. Now, moral philosophical, if you're going to use this particular approach, this would be beneficial for nonfiction and sometimes with works of fiction, especially with fables and whatnot. We can do that, especially highlighting certain values. Now, the formalistic approach is where a reader would perceive the piece, work of literature, as an autonomous and self-sufficient artistic object if they were to apply this to a particular criticism. It emphasizes reading closely and attentively to words and their varied meanings and certain expressions that the author has used. Now, in order to determine the meaning of the work, it looks for structures, patterns, imagery, and themes, figurative language, scene of juxtaposition, tone, and other literary devices. This is of which are all very important and very beneficial if you're doing a formalistic approach. So, a formalistic approach will look something like, for example, in poems, we would study the meter of the poem, the words used in a poem, the rhythm, or rather the rhyming scheme of the poem, and so on and so forth. So that is a very formalistic approach. If you use a moral philosophical approach to poems or poetry, then we would be looking at the value, moral value of the poem. Is it giving a moral value, or is it questioning a very philosophical topic or concept? Historical or biographical, we would be we will be looking at uh, the events or certain events, certain happenings within the poem that create a very historical um, a very historical perception or perspective of the poem. Is it giving the author is it giving a glimpse of the author's life, the author's immediate surrounding environment, immediate culture, and what have you. Okay. Now, like I said, we'll end here, and then we'll finish the rest the next meeting either online or face to face, given certain circumstances. Again, you are watching this video lesson because either we're having an emergency or we are in an online modality. Only, nothing more, nothing less. Now, I do hope this was helpful and this was beneficial for everyone. I know it is a mouthful. There's been a lot of topics given, so it can be overwhelming to most of you. So we'll end here and then we'll continue the next topic some other time. Anyway, thanks for joining. Thank you for watching, and I'll be seeing you next time. Stay safe. Have a great day.